Okay. Well, hi, Peter, and thanks again for agreeing to participate in our seminar. As you know, we've just watched one of your presentations, and has a lot of very useful information in it. And what we wanted to do is to add some additional items. And unfortunately, I have to ask the questions, trying to anticipate what some of our viewers might want to ask because of the time difference in Canada. And we certainly aren't going to expect you to be available at 2 a.m. in Canada to meet our schedule here. The first question I want to put to you is about economic modeling. You know, for most of us, it's kind of a big black box and we don't really understand how it works. So if you could just briefly indicate, you know, what governments typically do with economic models and how yours is different and some of the strengths and weaknesses, just to give us some background to understand, you know, the import of your work.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to be on this webinar. And as you say, 2 o'clock in the morning, not that I couldn't get up at 2, but I couldn't function at 2. So I'll do my best to give you some good answers to your questions. So the first one about modeling, you know, it's really, everybody has a model. Everybody, in the sense that everybody simplifies the world around them in order to understand it. We just can't cope with all of the noise and buzz and information. So the first thing to understand about a model is that it's a deliberate attempt to simplify the world in a useful way, trying to ignore the extraneous items and focus on the ones you think are critical. But when I think you asked me about models, you're going a step beyond that. It's the idea of building these models mathematically and using a computer. That's what I do, and that's what lots of economists do. We do it in different ways. It has the advantage of making your assumptions explicit, at least to somebody else who can look in and see how your model works and what it consists of. That's not that easy to do. Not everybody makes it that easy, but nonetheless, in principle, when we make a mathematical or a computer model, it's there for others to inspect. Whereas a mental model that we all have in our different ways is very hard to inspect, and people just sort of say things based upon their view of the world. And it's hard to understand why they've said it sometimes or what assumptions they're making. So the kind of model I built for the Canadian economy with my good friend and colleague Tim Jackson is unusual in terms of the method we use. We use something called system dynamics. Basically, we're saying the economy and the environment, that's the two are interrelated, are a set of systems. And so we use an approach which allows us to analyze these systems in terms of 2 very simple things: stocks and flows. A stock is anything like water in a bathtub's a stock. Water comes in through the tap, and that makes the stock bigger, goes out through the plug hole and makes it go down. Well, you know, you can apply that to so many things. Money in a bank account. You have the flow of money coming in when you put deposits or interest, and you have money taken out, and then you have a bank balance. So we use this approach. It has a number of features. One is we can handle what we call non-linear relationships. So you can think of something going up exponentially, like population can sometimes rise exponentially. If the birth rate exceeds the death rate, the population will expand exponentially. That's a very important feature of population. It allows for feedback to be analyzed, and so it has a way. It gives us a means of analyzing economic, social, environmental systems all simultaneously, and in particular because we don't have to use a single metric. It's not all done in dollars. So we can have greenhouse gases measured in greenhouse gas emissions, and we can have taxes measured in dollars. So that, I hope, gives you and everybody else on this webinar some idea of what this kind of approach to understanding our situation is all about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really helpful. It's good to have that kind of background. Another thing that we had briefly had exchanged about is the issue of declining growth. You made the comment somewhere that there's actually been a decline in economic growth over the last few decades, I believe. Could you clarify that for us and bring us up to date?
Yes. I'm referring to the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's been around for since early 60s, 1961, I think it was founded. And it's, if you like, a club of the wealthy countries. Jack, I'm going to have to interrupt this. I've got to plug my computer in. I'm so sorry. I thought it was plugged in. Hold on a sec.
Okay. Oh, no worries.
Okay. I'm sure there's a moral there in a discussion like this, and energy is going to play a role, I'm sure. So the OECD is a group of about 30, roughly 30 developed countries. And if you look at the GDP growth, either as a group or the individual countries, what you see since about late 60s, it fluctuates, but there's a steady decline in the rate of economic growth of those countries taken as a group. It's there for anybody to see. Go on to the OECD website. Anybody can look at the data, and you see that economic growth in these rich countries are on a downward trajectory. All I do is report that. It's tempting to project it forward, and you put a straight line through this fluctuating bunch of points, and you can, and if we carry on that trajectory, growth comes to a halt in a few years. I don't think that's going to happen necessarily, but that's the trend.
Is there a commonly understood explanation for it?
No, I don't think so. Different people have different things to say about it. One is that for most of that period, the rate of population growth was declining in those countries. So that means well, it's not straightforward, but there's a relationship between the size of the population and the labor force. And so if it's not growing as fast, but at the same time, you've had a change in the composition of the labor force with more women joining the labor force. So it doesn't move one to one, but that would be one consideration. There's a very interesting book by Robert Gordon, American economist, called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And it's a 750-page book. He goes into this sort of thing in great detail. He takes the view that the innovations, the technical innovations of the 20th century, particularly the electrification of so many things, can only happen once, and it's happened. And that the possibilities looking in, and he says that was slowing down towards the end of the 20th century. And of course, when he projects into the future, he thinks it's going to continue to slow, and he thinks economic growth in the US will essentially come to a halt as those trends continued mid-century, if not to zero, very close. So there's also been at the same time a change in the composition of GDP. It used to be more based on goods, and it's gone more to services. And so some would say that it's easier to get technological change and efficiency improvements when you're talking about physical things. But when you're talking about services, particularly if they're provided, by humans, it's hard to make them that much more efficient at the same sort of rate. So many, many things play into this. But the interesting thing remains that growth has been in decline for several decades in the rich countries.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And the question comes to my mind is what role energy descent plays in that, because we also know that there's been declining net energy available from oil and gas in particular, that net energy returns have peaked in prior decades, and that it's projected to peak for coal in the next decade or so. And of course, energy surplus is what allows the increase in GDP. Have many economists focused on the energy aspect, to your knowledge?
Not many, but I can tell you one who has and who's very well worth reading if people don't know about it, and that's Robert Ayres. That's Ayres, and he has a book co-authored by a fellow called, I think it's Bill Warr or Bob Warr, Warr, and it's all about the relationship between energy and economic growth. Bob is started out as an engineer, physicist, became an economist, so he's got a good grasp of the physical underpinnings, and just I don't know, a little bit of history here. When the early work on economic growth models was done in the 1950s, it was assumed that you'd be able to explain the growth in GDP by looking at the growth in the amount of capital. By capital, we mean buildings, equipment, infrastructure, not talking about money at this point, and labor. That if you've got more labor and more capital, you're going to have more at work, you're going to have more GDP. And what was discovered was that there was a gap. They called it the residual. They said, well, that must be technological change. Didn't have a separate measure of it, needed something, called it that, all right? Well, what Ayres and Ward did was to show that what was missing from that analysis was energy. You can't actually make anything just with a building and labor, not anything of the sort we would think of. You need some additional source of energy beyond human energy. And so they analyzed that the growth of the US economy in particular over the 20th century and say what made the difference was not so much technology, not something, but it was having access to a lot of cheap energy. And as that gets tougher, in the way your question suggested, then you would again expect growth to decline. And just how big a factor that was in the history that I described about the rich countries, I couldn't tell you, but I'm sure it's in their book.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions that occurs to me here is that given this phenomenon and the duration over which it's occurred, how are governments dealing with this? I mean, governments still seem to be pushing growth, you know, and not accepting this dynamic. Is
Well,
that the case? Are any governments beginning to? I mean, Japan, for example, has not shown a lot of growth, and again, it's specific issues related to Japan. But how, I mean, surely there must be people within governments and treasury departments who are saying, you know, this is inevitable. You know, we have to change the way we structure things so that we can deal with this phenomenon. Is that happening, or?
I couldn't tell you that. I just don't have enough contact with those kinds of people to be able to tell you what they're saying or thinking. But I do occasionally read government documents like budget papers, where they'll generally talk about what needs to be done to stimulate growth, or the OECD again, I'll mention them. Back, I think in 2005, they initiated a new annual report called Going for Growth. And each year it comes out, very well worth reading if you want to find out what that sort of central body is thinking about growth. It's all about giving advice at the country level as well as the group level as to what they can do to stimulate economic growth. But it doesn't change the track record of what we see.
Exactly.
So part of your question was, are they still as wedded to growth as ever, or are they adjusting their thinking because growth seems to be slowing down? I can't tell you whether they've adjusted their thinking. I don't see evidence of that in the sort of rhetoric that's coming out now around the pandemic. You know, we've got to get back on track, as if we were on some kind of track that was taking us to some place we really wanted to go to. We've got to get back to it. That's a very debatable proposition, but there's much more of that from what I've seen, at least on this side of the I can't remember where you are, the Pacific, than this is an opportunity to do something very different that will be better. It's more, you know, got to get businesses back running and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a real disconnect between, you know, economic priorities for most governments and the reality that is the phenomenon that's occurring before their eyes. I mean, there are some governments in New Zealand. New Zealand is one that where our Treasury Department has established a well-being framework, and is trying to supplement GDP with a variety of environmental and social well-being measures, and that seems to me quite progressive. Even it has its weaknesses, but it seems the right direction. And if we can encourage that, it's a desirable thing.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are 4 or 5 countries now that have signed on to this, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. It's a very good initiative.
Yes.
It came out of a group in Scotland, so that is promising. But there's very small economies, and but nonetheless, someone's got to take the lead, and maybe the rest of the world will look to them. Can I just make a sort of a commentary on this? Because you're sort of saying, well, why aren't economists, more generally, governments, what if you like, paying attention to maybe things like declining net energy? They are now beginning to pay attention to greenhouse gases, but I mean, it's taken decades, and yet we still haven't seen anything like the action that we've known for a long time will be necessary. Some of this comes, I think, down to the way economists are trained. Economists are trained to think of the economy as a sort of self-contained set of institutions, largely disconnected from the planet. So you can study now environmental economics in an economics department, but it'll be a speciality usually. There might be one class on it. I mean, literally one lecture on it in an overview, but it's not built into the worldview of economists to understand that the economy is in fact a subsystem of the planet, and it lives and dies by the materials and energy it can obtain from the planet, and of course it has to return that energy and materials in a degraded form, because whenever we use materials and energy, we reduce their quality, particularly with energy. And it's overloading, we're overloading the capacity of the planet to absorb what we take. Plus, we're transforming land at any chance we can get to somehow make it more productive in a narrowly defined sense. Well, this is not the worldview that most economists have. If you do see the world in that way, and then you see, well, okay, the economy is operating within the biosphere, I use that term, then you don't overlook these issues that you're driving at.
Do you think there's a new generation of economists coming along that have taken ecological economic courses or biophysical economic courses that are beginning to have an impact, or are there too few still?
Well, definitely there are too few. I no doubt about that. Are they having an impact? Marginally. Most of the economists that I know who work in the area of economy, environment, economy, and energy, less so with energy, but taking that sort of holistic view I tried to describe a moment ago, are not working in economics departments. They work in interdisciplinary departments, multidisciplinary departments, research centers, NGOs. I've trained quite a few ecological economists. I've been privileged to be able to teach in a university, but in an interdisciplinary faculty, not a department of economics. So it's not moving very fast. However, my view of the history of economics is that it changes. The economics that people study and learn and invent changes because the economy they're studying changes. It's not like the physical sciences where the physical world is essentially the same. Doesn't matter when you studied it, but in the social world, the economic world, things are changing. So you keep having to change the way you think about it and analyze it and so on. But there's a lag. And the people who studied it in one way that might have been right for one time tend to sort of stay wedded to that way of thinking and that set of questions that interested them when they were younger, and don't move with the times. And that's something that's hard to overcome.
Yes, no, I think it's an interesting observation, that the actual economy changes the theory. And it's good that there are these ecological economists, even though they may be too few, but to help us understand, those changes and put it in a very different, broader context, as you
Very
say.
much so. Yeah.
One of the other aspects, of course, of ecological economics is the whole issue of the steady state economy, which is different from a no growth economy in the sense that it's not just that it's not growing, but it's reducing to a level where the material throughput is based on renewable resources and a stable population and material throughput. I think you've mentioned in one of your videos that your model can handle a degrowth scenario. Can you talk about that a little bit and what some of the assumptions were about how that could work and impact on employment and inequity and so on?
Sure. Okay, if you'll allow me just a couple of preliminaries. When you talk about a steady state, well, you did try to say what you would hold steady, because you can hold different things steady in a steady state economy. The same with degrowth. Degrowth is more than just a different approach to economics. It's a political, social, ideological position that wants us to steer ourselves away from always resorting to growth as a solution to our problems, to recognize that growth can often be the cause of the problem. So it's a challenge to the growth paradigm, if you like. Now, when you model that, either in monetary terms or in physical terms, tons of materials or kilowatt hours of electricity, there's a danger that you lose that broader message of degrowth, because you're analyzing things in a narrow, analytical, empirical way. So when you think of a degrowth economy, in that sense, you could be saying an economy with declining GDP, gross domestic product, or an economy with declining material throughput would be the two things can move. I think they generally move together, but they can move along different tracks. So in my model, we use GDP for two main reasons. One is we want to influence people's view of growth in GDP, and if we don't use it, we lose the audience, certainly the audience of economists. Secondly, since we want to build an empirical model, the best data that's out there is actually GDP, not throughput. It's very hard to get comprehensive material flow data. There's more coming out now, but it's not gathered in the same careful way and with the same resources in it as GDP. So in our model, in the sustainable prosperity scenario, GDP growth slows down and then essentially levels off. But since the version that I think is in the lecture that you're showing as part of this webinar, I've added materials into the model. And what happens is, in that sustainable prosperity scenario with no growth in GDP, is the material throughput of the economy actually declines. So it's a steady state scenario in GDP terms, and it's a degrowth scenario where it really matters in material throughput. It comes about through a more efficient production processes, which say you get the same service, but you use less materials. That's built into the model. It comes about also from the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Now, renewables are very materials intensive. I mean, a photovoltaic panel or a wind turbine, there's a lot of material requirements. So there will be, and there is even in the model, a big demand for materials to generate energy that we call renewable. But at the same time, you save all that infrastructure and fossil fuels because of the transition. So the model, this is one of the beauties of these kinds of models, is we don't just do what I'm doing now, wave my hands and say, oh, I guess it'll work out. The model gives you a sort of a quantified result. And that's why I can say with some confidence in that scenario, in fact, it's a degrowth scenario in material terms.
Yeah. Can you give us some idea of in the degrowth scenario of the relationship between GDP decline and material flow decline?
Okay,
I
well,
mean,
as I said,
I think if I remember the,
in
I
that
was just gonna say,
scenario,
if I remember,
sorry.
as we say, I remember the figure you showed in your video of the amount of material flow is something in the neighborhood of 90
Oh, what is in that?
or 100 billion tons of material, which is just astonishing. And it's only a small portion of that is renewable. So I'm curious as to the relation that the model shows between GDP decline and material flow decline.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that the sustainable prosperity scenario doesn't have GDP decline. It has the growth rate declining, but GDP ends up leveling off. At the same time, materials required to support that constant level of GDP declines, largely because we become more efficient. That's as I was explaining a moment ago, and also the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. You actually can get a net gain in total materials. The material mix is very different, but you come out a little bit ahead. At least that's what the model was suggesting. Look, let's not get hung up too much on those particular scenarios. I want to say this, that if we're going to reduce the pressure on the biosphere from now almost 8 billion humans, and of course, we're not all in this equally together. The living standards and so on vary tremendously within countries, between countries. But speaking generally, if you'll allow me, if we're going to lower that environmental impact, we have to reduce our use of materials. And in doing that, that will help us reduce the output of waste. And my approach is we should be focusing policy on those objectives. And if the technological optimists, and there are lots of them out there, are right, it should be easily handled, because we'll find if we deliberately limit the throughput of materials and energy, it will increase their prices, which will give you exactly the kind of financial impetus and incentive that's needed to stimulate innovation in technologies that will save on resources and save on energy. So we tend to go the other way around. We tend to go, let's put resources into generating new technologies, R&D, support the new technologies, put them in place, and that will, we assume, reduce the requirement for materials and energy. The problem with that approach, and there's a whole history of this, every time we make a technology more efficient, it reduces costs. And in reducing costs, it encourages a greater use of the technology. So you get what's called the rebound effect. And sometimes that rebound effect can be so great that you end up using more resources because you've got a more efficient technology than less resources. So if our problem is, as I believe it is, that we're overusing the planet to supply us with the wherewithal for life, then that's where the focus of policy needs to be.
Yeah, I would agree. We need a dramatic reduction in material flow. The question is, what does your model say, or what are your ideas about what the impact of that would be on employment, on equity, on pollution, on some of the other economic indicators in the model? Because some people say that in order to move to a truly sustainable economy, it has to be a harvest economy rather than a mining economy. And that's a huge reduction in material throughput. Yeah. And so what happens with jobs? What happens with, the material advantages that most people assume it's their right to?
Yeah. Well, again, the benefit of having the model is it generates, if not the exact answer to the question you've asked, but certainly some insights. So in the sustainable prosperity scenario, there's no growth in GDP. And that's what most people understand by growth. So that's a non-growing economy. And as I said a moment ago, at the same time, I forgot actually, the material flow part is in that lecture. That was the first time I think I spoke about it. I'd forgotten about that. So you can see there the graph which shows materials declining. At the same time, employment is maintained. Unemployment, it fluctuates a bit more than in the other scenarios, but it stays around 6%, just the same as it would in the pro-growth, the business as usual scenario. Now, how does that happen? Well, it happens because the model provides for an increase in productivity, just like we've had in the past. We become better at making things. The question is, should we make more things as a result of that, or should we just spend less time working? Well, that's a choice. And people are making, funnily enough, during this pandemic, we've seen people making different choices, not all willingly, but some have, and say that they actually think they've adjusted their work-life balance better. Anyway, that's maybe a bit of an aside. Point is that with increases in productivity, in a sense, we always have a choice. How do we use that? Do we produce more stuff, which means using more materials, creating more waste, or do we keep the level of output more or less constant and work less? So in that scenario, the average time spent at work declines gradually over the 50-year horizon of the model. Not at an incredibly rapid rate. In fact, in Canada, well, I don't think we were very different from other countries at this time, the average work year was declining at a certain rate in the 60s and 70s, and that began to taper off. Didn't some people think it work year went up? It's debated. I'm going to say it more or less leveled off. If we were to resume that historic rate of decline in the work year, that's about what the model says we would have to do in order to maintain full employment at the same time as living without any further growth in GDP. So that's what I mean. That's you know, you don't need a very sophisticated model to understand that. Once you realize, as I've said now, but this will be the third time, if we become more productive, we can produce more stuff, we can work less, or some combination of the two. Historically, it's been a combination of the two. Now I'm saying, particularly in rich countries, we have the real option of saying, we'll do it all in terms of increased leisure. Because we're producing enough material things to get as much well-being and happiness from that as that source can provide. There's an enormous amount of literature, as I'm sure you're aware, showing that there's a real disconnect between growth in GDP and how happy people think they are. It plays a tiny role. You know, the relative position that people hold seems to be way more important than their absolute level, and so on. So I think we've got plenty of room here for some imaginative economic and social policy to do a better job.
Yeah. One of the things that I have a hard time getting my head around is the role of energy in this process, because I understand there are arguments, and I'd be interested in your take on it, that a lot of the productivity increases are really about having cheap energy. You know, a little bit of, you know, creativity and ingenuity, but the contribution, I think you mentioned Ayer's work, but I think there's others as well, have made the claim that what has really sparked the great increases in productivity have been the availability of cheap energy. And if energy descent is a genuine phenomenon, which many research groups working on it conclude it is, you know, we've declined, for example, from a net energy return with petroleum from 100 to 1 in the early 1900s to, you know, 20 to 1 now, and it's on a continued decline. So if, you know, can we keep productivity increases that lead to less need for work if we don't have any cheap energy? Or are we going to actually need more human labor as we did before the advent of fossil fuels? Are we going to actually have to work more?
Well, I'm on side with you, definitely, on the idea that net energy is a critical factor in an economy, that the indications are that the renewable technologies that are available now have a comparatively low net energy as compared with the fossil fuels that we are trying to replace with them. And so the question of what does that mean for the transition, the energy transition that we have to make, and what will it mean for the rest of the economy? One concern is that the energy sector will start having to absorb so much of the investment of the economy to produce enough net energy for everybody else, that there won't be sufficient investment in the rest of the economy to sustain anything like the rate of economic growth we've had in the past, maybe no economic growth at all, or maybe even a decline. I think all those are possible, and it's very hard to know. Well, I won't make a prediction as to what I think is going to happen. I will say this, though. I think we should prepare for, if you like, the worst scenario. In other words, prepare for living in a world with declining net energy. And that means thinking, again, rethinking what it is we want to get out of life. What is it we want from the economy? What can reasonably expect an economy to do? You may be right that we will be obliged to use more labor in the past than we've been using. I'm not sure that will happen. I think we've got there's still a lot of room for maneuver in terms of technology. I'll give you an example. I live in one of the worst cities in the world for reliance on the automobile. Toronto, beautiful city, but it was built around the automobile, and so there's a big dependence on that. It's pretty easy to show that if we switch a lot of people out of cars, fossil fuel cars, into electric powered public transit, you can move a lot of people with a lot less energy per person by public transport than you can when you've got 1 or 1.1 person in a car. So there's lots of inefficiency in the system, partly because energy has been so cheap. So I don't know. I don't have a position on whether saying on balance it's the reduction in net energy in the energy production system that's going to overwhelm us, because the inefficiencies that are there are not that great that even if we get rid of them, we can overcome the pressure of declining net energy. That's somebody else's bailiwick to comment on. But I think it's something we all ought to be thinking about, definitely.
Yeah, there are huge inefficiencies. I mean, when you think about the per capita energy consumption in a place like Canada or the US, it's almost double per capita what it is in Europe. It still has a very high level of quality of life. So clearly, we can be happy and have satisfied lives with considerably less energy.
Of course, their cities weren't built for cars, most of them.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was easier to move into public transit than it is in a country where they were built around the car. The biggest highway near me at one point, I think, had 24 lanes. That's enormous.
I know, it's astonishing.
And it gets jam-packed, and we had to build they built another highway because it was so packed. Anyway.
Yeah, which of course fills up very quickly.
Except it's a toll road. So it doesn't. Yeah.
Peter, in the video that we watched, you talk about 13 changes that are needed. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about those. I know you probably wrote those a few years ago, and whether you've had any additional insights or ideas about what the priorities are, and how we transition our economy from a fossil fuel driven one and that generates so much inequality to one that's more compatible with human needs.
Well, okay, I wrote my book, Managing Without Growth. It was published in 2007, 2008. And I think there were 12 items there. And there's a second edition, 2019, which has 13 items. It didn't change very much, partly because not a lot was done to act on those goals. And you can find similar lists from many commentators, and they overlap quite a lot. So I don't remember them all, but the first one which I clearly do remember, was the use of different metrics. That's the term we use, different measures to judge our success. GDP was never intended to be used as some sort of overall assessment of how an economy is doing. The inventor, that's the right term, of GDP, Simon Kuznets, an American, famously spoke before the US Senate committee in 1934 and said it would be a mistake to use national income, which is equivalent to GDP, as a measure of the well-being of the economy. Nonetheless, that's what has happened. And there's a history to that, but we don't necessarily have to go into that. But I will say this is one area where there's been some movement over the years. There was a very, very good report done in 2009 at the behest of President Sarkozy of France. It involved Joseph Stiglitz, very eminent economist, a French economist called Fitoussi. I'm sorry, he's probably very well known, but had never heard of him before. And the third one was Amartya Sen, another very well-known economist and very strong on the ethics side of the question. And they did a thorough review of alternative measures and were roundly critical of relying so much on GDP. So that comes from a very high level. And the OECD I mentioned before, where they're going for growth, they've also done work. They produced a report called Beyond Growth, where they look at other metrics. But there's this terrible time lag. We've got a whole cadre of national income accountants, as they're called, whose job it is to estimate all the statistics that go into GDP. And governments are used to it. People talk about it. There's a familiarity with it. I bet you if you ask 99 people out of 100, what's in GDP, how's it measured, they wouldn't know the answer. You have to study it. It's a bit like a sausage.
One of the things that strikes me about that whole issue of different metrics is that it assumes a different vision of the economy and of a society.
Well, sorry.
And I'm just wondering if the same way that your model requires making assumptions explicit, are you aware of any visioning exercises that have made some of the values and the goals explicit for a different kind of economy that would not require growth, but give us this human well-being that we're
Sure, there's lots going on. I think we can be much more upbeat on this particular subject than maybe this whole discussion has been up to this point. Well, the Wellbeing Alliance, Economy Alliance that we were mentioning before is doing a lot people talk in terms of a dashboard. They say you wouldn't drive a motor car just with one indicator. You need several. You don't have to keep putting everything into one and thinking that's all you need. And so when you start thinking, well, what's important? Well, employment's important. Price stability is important. Inequality is important. So you can have, and there are measures of each of these. And so the very first step that we can take is to say, let's look at this set of indicators and judge our progress against them and be content with the fact that some will say we're getting better and some will say we're getting worse. And not feel frustrated that we haven't got it all wrapped up in a single number and we can say it's risen by 2% or 3% in the last year. That's especially if you don't really know what it was measuring. So there's a lot of alternative indicators out there. Now in the model, you may recall we have the Sustainable Prosperity Index, where we simply took 7 items that are in the model, which includes GDP per capita, by the way, but it includes the unemployment rate, various debt rates, environmental burden index, the measure of environmental pressure, and so on. And then we add them up. Now, when you add up things that are different, you have to attribute weights to them. That's very subjective. Well, our model, we used our weights, but anybody can, in principle, change the weights to define their own values. It's where you need a public discussion and debate about the relative importance of things. And that's exactly what we get in Canada, I'm sure in New Zealand, around election time, where different parties will take somewhat slightly different positions in terms of priorities. We need to magnify that, make that discussion more well informed by data, and have it on an ongoing basis, not once every 4 or 5 years. That seems to be the custom. So I'm quite upbeat on this. And by the way, can I just get back to a point you made? I don't think you need the new vision first. I think this is an iterative process. I think when you understand that things are not going that well, and we're relying on a measure which isn't sensitive to the things that aren't going well, you can easily say, well, then let's see what else we ought to be looking at. You don't necessarily change your vision, but there's a nice feedback here, because once you start measuring change in a different way, then you begin saying, well, what do we have to do to get this thing to work better, to get these things to work better, to get people reporting that they're happier more frequently than they're unhappy, to get people having a greater sense of security. Once we're talking in that language and we're measuring those things, then I think you get positive change. I don't know how rapid, but I think it moves us in the right direction. So that's the first item. We've got to measure success differently. By the way, not just in terms of national economics. I think companies need to do that. And I think we as citizens, and we do, but we need to do more of that sort of reflection on what makes for the good life, and strive for that, and not just go after more money.
Yes, well, that's exactly, I think, where we need to focus. That's a really good summing up of the work. This has been extremely helpful, Peter. Really appreciate your availability, and sorry that it couldn't be live for the rest of the participants, but I've certainly enjoyed our chat, and I'm sure the participants will. I hope that I can do some justice to any questions they may put after this recording. So we'll stop the recording at this point. Thank you.